Most High be praised today. Bless the Almighty for another opportunity to be able to provide teaching today. I want to say welcome to each one of you who are here with us. And I want to say welcome to you who have gathered with us by live stream. You have chosen to attend our School of Messiah Bible Institute, and we are in the course called Biblical Theology 2. Biblical Theology 2. And today, as we are in this course, going through a number of lessons, subjects in this course. We've covered mankind, we've covered sin, we have covered biblical holiness, which is what we covered on last Sabbath in our class session. And today we want to look at the subject of the covenant people of Elohim. The covenant people of Elohim. And for those who are joining with us by live stream, I'd like to advise you to go to the website at www.ncmmi.20m.com, and you want to go to the written word library. That's important. You go there. And as you go there, we want you to go to the free biblical studies. And when you get to free biblical studies in the written word library, you want to go to Biblical Theology 2. And you can download the outline that we're using today. And the outline is the covenant people of Elohim. That way you can follow along with us as we are covering this subject today. You can go to the website and go to the written word library. That's the link on the website. And you want to go to free biblical studies, Biblical Theology 2. The lesson outline is the covenant people of Elohim. And we're going to be looking at part 1 today. The covenant people of Elohim I have in 3 parts, and we're going to look at part 1 today. All right, before we delve into this subject, let's have a word of prayer. Abba Yah, thank you so much for your mercies, your great grace, your kindness, your goodness to us. We thank you for Yeshua, our King, whom you have given to be our redemption, and ask for your wisdom as we prepare to teach this lesson today. May each one assembled have an open heart. May they have an open mind, prepared to receive truth. And may you, O Most High, by your Spirit, fill each one. And we will give you the praise and the credit for everything accomplished. In Yeshua's great name. Amen. All right. We want to look at the definitions that are given to us here. And we have 4 words that we're going to look at. And these are Greek and Hebrew words. And it's my practice to always begin with the Hebrew terms because our Bible is a Hebraic book, and the foundation is Hebraic. The writings of the apostles which have preserved, or which have been preserved to us here in the Western world, they preserve Hebraic thought and Hebraic culture. So we will always emphasize the Hebraic meanings as the primary basis for our understanding terminology. Very important. We go from Greek in the writings of the apostles, but we do not depend upon the Greek definitions that we receive from Greek culture. We look at the Greek and find the equivalent Hebrew definition, because in the mind of the writers, they were thinking Hebraic and they were writing in the language of the Greeks. And so in their minds, they are trying to convey a Hebraic understanding, even though they're using Greek words. So when we look at our Greek words, we want to immediately go back and find the equivalent Hebrew. Now, first two words we're going to look at, and they're the same. They come out of the same root. The word is kahal and kahilat. Sometimes kahilat is pronounced kahila. And these two words are translated as congregation. They're translated as congregation. They're the Hebrew terms which are translated meaning congregation. So the kahal, the kahilat, or the kahila. This is a term which is used to refer to the congregation of Israel or the congregation of Yahuwah, as these are the terms that are used in the scriptures. We want to be mindful of these words. And it's the only term used in the Hebrew scriptures to refer to the assembly of the people of Elohim. There's another term in Hebrew, and it is defined as the called out. It's called mikra. However, this term is used a little bit differently, and I'm introducing it because this word seems to fit as far as the equivalent meaning of the Greek word ekklesia, which is what we're going to introduce next. But what we find is that it is not the term that ekklesia actually refers to when ekklesia is used in translation. So we want to look at the term ekklesia. This is the Greek word, and most Bible teachers are familiar with this Greek term ekklesia. This is the root Greek term where you get the term ecclesiastic from, or ecclesiastical. And this is a term that denotes things with a reference to the church. And of course, the word church is an English word that has been used to translate ekklesia. I've chosen to stick with the term congregation. That seems to be a more appropriate term to use to describe the assembly of the people of the Most High. But let's define ekklesia. Okay, ekklesia is a Greek term, and this Greek term ekklesia, however, this word is used to translate the Hebrew terms kahal and kehilat. So when we look at the word ecclesia, even though mikra literally means the called out in Hebrew, the term ecclesia in the Greek language is the term that is used to translate the Hebrew word kehal and kehalah. Now, one might ask, where do we have that evidence? Okay? Before English came on the scene, you had the language of the Greeks, the language of the Romans, you had the language of the peoples living in the Mesopotamian regions, the Semitic languages, and Hebrew and Aramaic were amongst those Semitic languages. Now, with reference to the scriptures, our scriptures, before the time of Messiah and the writings of the apostles, the scriptures were in the Hebrew language, and some parts of it was in Aramaic. When the 3rd century came, 3rd century BCE, before the Common Era or before Messiah, during the period of the Greek Empire, most of the known Mediterranean world was speaking Greek. And much of the world in the East, with respect to where the land of Israel is, they were also speaking Greek because of what Alexander the Great did in wanting to ensure that all of his empire would be Greek speaking. So in the 3rd century BCE, the Hebrew scriptures were translated into the Greek language. When that was done, and they translated these words, kahal and kehilat, the Greek equivalent that was used was the word ecclesia. And the literal definition of ecclesia in the Greek understanding of that word is the called out. And from a Greek cultural definition, it refers to a called out assembly whose purpose was to transact business with respect to affairs of government. Now that is the Greek definition from a Greek cultural perspective. That is not, and I want to say very, very emphatically, that is not the biblical understanding of describing the people of the Most High. The proper way in which the people of the Most High are described is rooted in the terms kehal and kehilah. Okay? It's important that we understand this. Now, the reason why I'm making these distinctions is because what has happened in theological schools of thought when we talk about subjects such as these, what happens is that Bible teachers and Bible scholars go to the Greek definition, which is rooted in Greek culture. And what they do is they take that word without considering the fact that when the scriptures were written by the apostles, they were Hebrew-thinking people. I hope you're catching this. They were Hebrew-thinking people. They used Hebrew terminology. And so in their understanding, when they use terms to describe the congregation of Elohim, or the people of Elohim, or the people, or the assembly of Elohim, they're using terms that are rooted in Greek, not Greek, but are rooted in Hebrew culture. And this is why it's important to understand the terms from the Hebraic culture perspective. Because when we get the definitions from the Greek, we are not considering the fact that there are elements in the Greek culture that do not have anything to do with the Hebraic thinking or the commandments of the Almighty. So anytime we're translating, we're just trying to find an equivalent term in another language that is similar. But you have to be careful, because sometimes when you look at the definition of these words in another language, which is attached to a culture, you begin to bring into play ideas and concepts that are attached to a culture, which is also attached to paganism. And I'm going to show that when we look at how ecclesia has been translated into English. And so for those who are in this class for the first time, I hope that you have an open mind, because sometimes the terminology that we use and sometimes the information we bring out, it challenges the Western cultural perspective on the Bible. And it's not my intention to offend anyone's particular belief system or understanding. The goal is that we understand the terminology and words and look at their etymology so that we can see where they came from, what they're attached to, what they really mean. All right? So, we have here ecclesia, literally means to call out. All right? We know that this word is also the term that is used to translate the terms kehal and kehalat. So when you look at this Greek word ecclesia, which is used primarily in the writings of the apostles, commonly called the New Testament, that word has been translated in English as church. Okay? And when you go into the Hebrew scriptures and you look at words used to refer to the people of Elohim, the assembly of Elohim, you will find the translated words from the Hebrew into English as congregation. And what happens is, because you see the word congregation in the Hebrew scriptures and you see the word church in the writings of the apostles, commonly called New Testament scriptures, there is an idea that has been developed that the church and the congregation are two totally separate things. You have a school of thought called dispensationalism that says that the church was hidden and that the church came during the time of the Messiah, because you don't find the church, okay, in what they call the Old Testament. And the problem here that we have has to do with not understanding the terms that are equivalent when you go from Hebrew to Greek. So when you look at the word ecclesia, which has been translated in English as church, it is the equivalent of kehal and kehalat. So when you look in your Bibles and you see the word congregation as an English translation from the Hebrew in the Hebrew scriptures, which is what the Western Christian system calls the Old Testament, and you have the writings of the apostles, commonly called the New Testament, and you see ecclesia being translated as church, they are the same thing. That's the point that we're making. Ecclesia is equivalent with kehalat. So when you see the word congregation in the Hebrew scriptures, when you see the word church in the writings of the apostles, it is identical. The words are identical. They are referring to the assembly of the people of Elohim. All right? It's important that we understand that. One of the ways in which we can see that evidence is if you look over in the book of Acts. And in the book of Acts, there's a statement that's made, I believe it's in chapter 3, I think it is. I'm not sure, but, you know, because I didn't pull it up, but I'm just sharing some things because I'm laying some foundation before we get into the general scope of what we're going to be covering in the lesson. There's a statement that's made with reference to Joshua, and it says that this is the one who was with Joshua. Now, in the Hebrew, not in the Greek scriptures, in the writings of the apostles, it will say this is who was with Jesus, who was with the church in the wilderness. So you see the phrase church in the wilderness in the scriptures. That literally is the congregation in the wilderness. Okay? Referring to Joshua and the congregation of Israel in the wilderness with Joshua. So this is how we can see an evidence of the translation in the Greek translated scriptures, or the scriptures that have been translated from the Greek into English. We see that even when it's referring to the congregation in the wilderness that was with Joshua, that when they translated the word ecclesia, they translated it as church. Okay? So that's important to note, because we have to be mindful of terms that we use to translate other terms. Now, another thing I want to point out has to do with the fact that we need to understand Israel, the word Israel, the term Israel. So I want to define Israel etymologically. Israel, or Yisrael, it's more properly pronounced, is a compound word derived from the following Hebrew words. We see the Yish, which is where we get the word man from, or the male from, the Yish. The Sarah, which is the middle portion of that word, Sar. Yisra, or Yisara. Sarah is a term which means prince or ruler. It means one who rules, one who has power. Okay? And then the last part of the word Yisrael is El. El is the term that means the mighty one. The mighty one. That's what the term El means. The strong authority. El, the Aleph and the Lamed in Hebrew. The Aleph, which is the ox head, it means strength. The Lamed, which represents the shepherd's staff, means authority. So when you see the Aleph and the Lamed put together, we pronounce it as El. The term El literally means the strong, mighty authority. All right? That's what the term El means. The strong authority. The ruling strong authority. So when we put these pieces of this compound word together, we have Yisrael. It means the man who rules with El. The man who rules with the mighty one. The man who rules with Elohim. And this word is descriptive of redeemed humanity. That's what this term is descriptive of. And this term is a name that was given to our ancestor Yaakov, commonly called Jacob. So, when we look at this, we need to note that the name Yisrael is very significant. It denotes and reflects the purpose and the destiny of Elohim's covenant people. So when we talk about the covenant people of Elohim, we are talking about Yisrael. That's what we're talking about, Yisrael. So let's go and carry on with other things that have to deal with the covenant people. So we want to look at names and phrases associated with the covenant people that has been applied to Elohim's covenant people. We made mention of this already. Israel, or congregation of Israel. You can find that in the book of Numbers, chapter 16, verse 9. We also see the phrase congregation of Yahuwah. We find that also in Numbers 27:17. The Kechelat Yahuwah, congregation of Yahuwah. We also see the phrase house of Yisrael. We see that in Exodus chapter 40, verse 38, along with many other places where we see the term house of Yisrael. That's a very common phrase that's used. We also see the term house of Elohim. Elohim is translated in English as God, and in my teaching I have made it a point to not use the word God, and I'm not going to go into the details of why I don't use it, because there will be some explaining to do when you tell individuals that you don't use the word God. They look at you funny because they think, why don't you want to use the word God? Why do you want to use the ancient terminology? And there's a reason for that. And when we look at the word God, God is an English word that has its etymological foundation in the name Odin. Odin was called Gadon and God. I just leave it there. For those who are really interested in wanting to find out, do an etymological study, and there will be some interesting things you will discover. However, when we use Elohim, I use Elohim, so when we talk about the house of Elohim, you would think of it as house of God. All right? So in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15, we find that phrase used. We also find house of Elohim used in 1 Peter chapter 4, 17. We also find the phrase Israel of Elohim, or Israel of God, as it is translated in the English scriptures. And that's found in Galatians chapter 6, verse 16. We also find the phrase assembly of Elohim, or church of Elohim, or church of God, which is a more common phrase that many believers are associated with. And we find that noted in Acts chapter 20, verse 28. And we find that phrase also used in many other places, such as in the writings and letters of the Apostle Paul. He uses that phrase as well. We also see the phrase flock of Elohim. And in Ezekiel chapter 34, verse 31, and in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 2, we see the phrase flock of Elohim, or as it's translated in English, flock of God. Also, we see the bride of Messiah. In Revelation chapter 21, verse 9, we see the bride of Messiah, or as commonly called in English translations, bride of Christ. So these are the names and phrases that are applied to Elohim's covenant people. Now we want to look at the patriarchal covenants and promises. Here's where we find the foundations, the origins of the house of Israel. the fathers. That's what we want to look at here. We begin with the Abrahamic promises. The Most High promised Abraham that he would make him to be a great nation, that a great nation would come from him. That's found in Genesis. Bereshit is the Hebrew name for the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verse 2. Also, we find that through Abraham's descendants, all the people of the earth, or all the families of the earth, shall be blessed. That's found in Bereshit, or Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, Genesis chapter 22, verse 18. So we find these two promises that Elohim has made, that he spoke to our father, Abraham, regarding a great nation that would come out from him, and that through this great nation all the families of the earth would be blessed. Now, anytime we use the word blessed, it's important that we understand that word blessed Hebraically means literally being supported by the Creator. That's what it literally means, Hebraically. Now we want to look at the Abrahamic covenant, or the covenant that the Most High made with Abraham. This is the sealing of the deal, the sealing of the promises, the way in which everything that Elohim has communicated to Abraham, he seals it, or he makes it good by a covenant, an agreement, a lasting blood covenant. So, the covenant states that Abraham would be the father of many people. This is noted in Genesis chapter 17, verse 4. Also, we want to note that to be established with Abraham and his seed as an everlasting covenant. So we find that this covenant that Elohim made with Abraham would be an everlasting covenant, not just with our father Abraham, but also with his descendants, his seed. I want to go to Genesis 17. I want to read from there. Just give me a moment. And I want to go to the 7th verse. In the 7th verse it says, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be Elohim to you and to your offspring after you. Hear that? Powerful. So the Most High promises Abraham that he will not only be Elohim to Abraham, that he would not only be the strong authority and mighty one to Abraham, but the strong authority and mighty one to his offspring, his descendants. So all of us blood-descended Israelites, all right? We have a covenant through Abraham, which we know finds its fullness in our Messiah, Yeshua. But because of the promise made to Abraham, the Most High has promised that he would be Elohim to us. And this is good. Now, those who are in the Messiah, Yeshua, they have been regarded as Abraham's seed, whether they are blood descendants or whether they are not blood descendants. If they are in the Messiah, Galatians says, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promises. So this is some good stuff here. But here's the foundational promises that are not just connected to Abraham, but also to his descendants. That includes us. All right? Not only does that include us that are in the Messiah, but those who are not yet in the Messiah. Elohim has an obligation because of this promise he made to Abraham also to deal with you and to work with you to bring you back into the way, which is the Messiah, so that he can be your Elohim as he has promised. So he is working on those who are the blood descendants of Abraham. All right? That's important to know. We also want to look at the fact that the land of Canaan has been given to Abraham and his seed as an everlasting possession, according to Genesis 17:8. Now I'm going to read the 8th verse of Genesis chapter 17, and it says, "And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land where you are now an alien, all the land of Canaan, for a perpetual holding, and I will be their Elohim." All right. So here we have the promise of the land. Okay? The promise of the land is to those who are descendants of Abraham. And I know I might be getting a little bit ahead of myself, but when the Messiah returns, he's going to bring us into that land of Canaan. And from there, that land of Canaan, which is called Yisrael, we will rule and have dominion on the earth with Yahshua. All right. We also want to note that within this Abrahamic covenant, circumcision of all the males to be an external sign of the covenant. This is noted in verses 10 through 12 of chapter 17. Next point we want to make has to do with the fact that this Abrahamic covenant is confirmed with Yitzhak, or Isaac. Isaac's name in Hebrew is Yitzhak. That's how you say it, Yitzhak, Isaac. So in Genesis, Bereshit 26, verses 2 through 5, here's where we find the Most High showing up to Isaac and confirming the covenant that he made with Abraham to Isaac. So Elohim did not forget what he had promised to Abraham, because as Abraham was transitioning off the scene, the Most High shows up to Isaac. So Isaac would have full knowledge of the covenant, and that Isaac would have relationship with the Elohim of Abraham, the mighty one of Abraham. This is the way in which the Most High, throughout human history, was bringing about his purposes through the fathers, who were the foundation of the covenant people. Also, this covenant that was made with Abraham, it was confirmed also with Jacob. Genesis chapter 28. And this part I want to read just so that we can see how the Most High was working. It's important that we see this, because when we recognize that Elohim is moving down through time, and as he comes to each father of each generation, he confirms the same covenant that he made with Abraham. So let's look at Genesis chapter 28, verses 12 through 15. Look at what it says. Verse 12 of chapter 28. "And he dreamed that there was a ladder set upon the earth, the top of it reaching to the heavens, and the angels of Elohim were ascending and descending on it. And Yahuwah stood beside him and said, I am Yahuwah, the Elohim of Abraham your father, and the Elohim of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. And your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Now, what's interesting about this that we read is that the Most High confirms the promise, confirms the covenant that he made with Abraham. But what's interesting that we need to know when we look at this, when the Most High spoke to Abraham and he said that I'm going to bless your descendants and your seed, all right, that meant that not only was he going to bless the descendants that would come through Isaac, but also Abraham's descendants that came through Ishmael, and also the sons that he had with his second wife, Keturah. Those descendants as well also were peoples that circumcised themselves. And there were certain blessings upon them. But the channeling of the promises where the seed or where the Messiah would come through would be through Isaac. And the Most High is continually isolating that. Because when you get to the time of Jacob, you find that all of this that the Most High told Jacob is specifically to his descendants, which would compose the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, Jacob had a brother whose name was Esau. And there was a word spoken over Esau, how Esau would be great, and how Esau would become great by the sword. Now, I'm not talking about Esau nor his descendants today, but I just wanted to make a comparison and a contrast here. In this promise that the Almighty makes with Jacob, here's where it is isolated specifically to the 12 tribes of Israel, and it would be inclusive of all of those who become a part of the 12 tribes of Israel, or a part of the house of Israel, by being grafted in, by conversion, and coming in agreement with the Israelites. So this is a powerful promise that the Most High made, where it talks about the blessing that through your descendants all the families of the earth will be blessed. Here's where the Almighty is isolating it and channeling it, that is going to be Abraham, Isaac, Yaakov, or Jacob. Okay? So now what we discover as we are beginning to move through and discovering the development of the covenant people of Elohim, we have the foundational fathers. From the time in which Jacob and his sons went into Egypt, they were enslaved by Mitzrayim. That's Egypt, Mitzrayim. And then the Almighty sent Moses, to deliver them and to bring them out. So what we're going to look at now has to do with the first covenant made with the people of Elohim. And so after Moses brings the Israelites out of Egyptian captivity, they're brought to Mount Sinai. And if you read in Exodus chapter 19, verses 1 through 11, it describes the congregation of Israel at Mount Sinai. Now, what's interesting about the congregation of Israel and the constituents of the congregation of Israel after they came out of captivity is that you had not only blood descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but you also had, as the scriptures record, a mixed multitude that also came out of Egypt with them. Now, this mixed multitude wasn't just there just as added information in the scriptures. It's important that we recognize what Elohim was doing based upon the faith choice of the people. You got to ask, how did the mixed multitude get to become a part of this congregation of Israel? Because when the people were leaving Egypt and the Red Sea opened, or the Sea of Reeds opened, not only were the blood-descended Israelites walking on dry ground across, the ground while the waters were held up, but also this mixed multitude of people that chose to follow the Israelites, they also walked across on this dry ground as well and were saved just like the blood-descended Israelites were. So there are some things that we need to recognize that's not explicitly stated. There is a group of people here. They were composed of Ethiopians, Egyptians, Kenizzites, some Edomites, and other peoples. And they just called it a mixed multitude because these were non-Israelite people that attached themselves to the Israelites, believed and decided to follow their Elohim because, they saw all of the mighty acts of the Most High in Egypt. They saw what the Most High did. So they followed the Israelites. The Most High was merciful upon them, and he delivered them out of Egypt as well. If the Most High had not have delivered them, then they would have not have been able to go across the Sea of Reeds on dry ground, but they did. That's evidence to know that these people had made a faith choice to believe in the Elohim of Israel, and they had attached themselves to Israel. Now, all of them had came across, all right? We see the mercy of Elohim, because the mercy of Elohim could not have been, he didn't have to extend this mercy to them. This is where we see evidence of the fact that Elohim's purpose was to channel his ways through the Israelites for the purpose of reaching the nations with the way of Elohim. The demonstration of his power in Egypt, shown as a witness, was an evangelistic tool that brought these non-Hebrews to follow the Elohim of Israel. And they left with them. The Most High was merciful to them because he kept the waters up so that the mixed multitude could get across as well. That's the mercies. All right? That's the mercies. Because when the Egyptians who were trying to destroy the people of the Almighty, when they came into the sea, the waters closed in upon them and they were destroyed. So we see preference there. Preference comes to those who repent and follow the Almighty, in contrast to those who reject and who hate the way of the Almighty. So I just want to make note of that. Now, the first covenant that was made with the people of Elohim is the first congregational covenant. Exodus 19 verses 1 through 11, I mentioned that. Now, when you read in Exodus chapter 20, here's where we see the Torah given as the conditions of the covenant. The conditions of the covenant, regarded as the Torah, are composed in what is called commandments, statutes, and judgments. All right? Commandments, statutes, and judgments. The commandments of Elohim are found in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 17. Also in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 through 21, they're later regarded as statutes. The term statute, it's a word in Hebrew called kokek. It literally means laws engraved in stone. We also have the judgments. The judgments are regarded as rules or decrees. And we see the judgments noted in Exodus chapter 21, beginning at verse 1, all the way through to chapter 23, verse 33. Some features that we want to note about this covenant that was made is that the covenant was ratified with blood. Exodus chapter 24, verse 7 through 8. We also note within the framework of this covenant that there is a priesthood within the framework of this covenant. And the priesthood was localized to the tribe of Levi. So the tribe of Levi, or Levi, the tribe of Levi became the tribe responsible for service specifically rendered to Elohim. And it had to do with the upkeep of the tabernacle and the tribe's priests, or the tribe's Kohen, the Kohanim, was Aaron. Aaron and his descendants will be the ones responsible for specifically ministering to the Most High and were consecrated to perform the service of sacrifices, offerings, going into the temple, all of those things that had to do with being a Kohen unto Elohim on the behalf of the people, and as a means of teaching the people Torah. This is what their responsibility was. Also, we need to note that the conditions of the covenant were restated in Deuteronomy, or Devarim, chapter 5, verses 1 through 21. We need to note within the framework of the covenant that there are blessings that are attached to this covenant. If you look in Deuteronomy, or Devarim, chapter 28, verses 1 through 14, we find the blessings of the covenant. And also in the latter part of that 28th chapter, verses 15 through 68, we also have the curses resulting from disobedience or the breaking of the covenant. Now we want to look at citizenship in the congregation of Israel under the first covenant. Now, all of these things that we're talking about here, as it has to do with citizenship, is very important. We begin to see right off the bat, as the Almighty is laying structure to the house of Israel, as his covenant people, as his bride. Because that's what's going on here. We have a marriage going on here between the house of Israel and with Yahuwah. If you want to get some support on what I just said, you can look over in Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 31, when Jeremiah, when Yirmiyahu begins to talk about the renewed covenant. The Most High says that the covenant that I had with you, I was a husband to you. And so this is the first covenant that was made, and it is a marriage that is going on here. So, citizenship in the congregation of Israel, or membership in the congregation of Israel, okay? So we find that it is composed of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the children of Israel. That's noted in Exodus chapter 19, verses 1 through 9. Also, we need to note that there was a mixed multitude that was a part of this. Mixed multitude from Egypt, as I mentioned, most likely was composed of Egyptians and Ethiopians and Kenizzites and people of another ethnicity. We find this noted in chapter 12, verse 38 of Shemot. Shemot is Exodus. So let's go to chapter 12 of Exodus. And this is where it talks about the mixed multitude. Verse 38. Listen to this. In verse 38 it says, a mixed multitude or mixed crowd also went up with them, and livestock in great numbers, both flocks and herds. All right? So what we find here is that when the people were leaving from Egypt, after celebrating the Passover, after the death angel came through and killed the firstborn in Egypt, a mixed multitude left with them. Here's the evidence of that. So it wasn't just blood-descended Israelites. And all of these people became a part of this covenant. See? Right from the onset, when the first covenant was made, we have the descendants of Abraham and Gentile peoples that became a part of Israel. And all of them received the covenant. All of them. There was no such thing as two separate laws or two separate Torahs. It's only one covenant for the whole people. So let's keep going. We also find some specific things that the Most High states as we look at Devarim chapter 23, verse 3. Because what we find here is that the Most High says that the Ammonite and the Moabite, after the 10th generation, shall be able to become a part of the house of Israel. Let's check that out. And there's a reason why the Most High stated that the Ammonite and the Moabite could not come into Israel until after the 10th generation. And the reason why is because as the Israelites were passing through these nations, passing through their territorial areas on their way to Canaan, Ammon and Moab gave them trouble as they were passing through. So the Most High said, okay, I'm not going to allow any of you to become a part of my people until after the 10th generation. Devarim or Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 3. Let me go there. All right. All right. Here we go. So we're going to look at the third verse. It says, "No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of Yahuwah, even to the 10th generation. None of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of Yahuwah, because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, son of Beor, from Pathor of Mesopotamia, to curse you." So what happened here was, because of what they did, the Most High said, they didn't bring you food or water as you were on your journey. They did not become a blessing to you. So I'm not going to allow any of them to come into my assembly until the 10th generation. Now, this is a side note, but what is interesting about this statement that the Most High made, he literally kept his word. Because when you go through the history of our ancient fathers, it is not up until the time of Ruth. Ruth was a Moabitess. It wasn't up until the time of Ruth that you find Ruth becoming a part of the house of Israel. Remember, Ruth, she said to Naomi that my people are your people. Your Elohim is my Elohim. And so Ruth, when you count the generations from the time of the Israelites going to the land of Canaan, you mark that up to the time of Ruth, that's 10 generations. Check it out. It's 10 generations. So we find that the Almighty was very specific in what he had to say. He said, none of y'all are going to even become a part of my people until after the 10th generation. And she became part of Israel. She was the grandmother of King David. All right? So this is important to see this. But the Most High has always opened the door for all people to become a part of Israel. But there were certain ones that he said, I'm not going to let y'all in until XYZ amount of time passes because of what you did. All right? And this has to do with the time from which they left out of Egypt. Now, let's look also at the same chapter, Deuteronomy 23. I want to look at verses 7 through 8. And here's what the Most High says, that the Egyptians and the Edomites talked about, that the Egyptians and the Edomites can be a part of Israel. And he says that they can come in after the 3rd generation. Now this has to do marking the time that the house of Israel left Egypt. So beginning with the leaving out, the departure from Egypt, that's when the time clock begins where other people can come in. And so this says that the Edomites and the Egyptians after the 3rd generation. I'm going to read verses 7 and 8. It says, you shall not abhor any of the Edomites, for they are your brothers. You shall not abhor any of the Egyptians, because you were an alien residing in their land. The children of the 3rd generation that are born to them may be admitted to the assembly of Yahuwah. That term assembly in this translation is translated as congregation. It's still the term kehal, to the kahal. So what we find here is that the Most High is opening the door for non-Israelite people to join Israel. All right. Now we also want to look at Isaiah chapter 56, verse 3 through 8. Because this is where the Almighty is very specific and emphatic that all people can become a part of Israel. Now, during the time of Isaiah, there's been a number of generations that have passed. So 10 generations and 3 generations, that's all said and done. By the time you get to Isaiah, that's all said and done. And so listen to what the Almighty says here in Isaiah. In Yeshayahu, that's the Hebrew name for Isaiah. You want to go to 56th chapter, verses 3 through 8. This is, I love reading this because this really shows us the heart and the mind and the intention of the Almighty for all people to be joined to his house. And the reason why I'm bringing all this out specifically is because there are those who teach with regard to Israel where they have made a distinction between the church and Israel, and they say that the church is composed of all people and Israel is the Jewish people. And this ideology, this concept, is not consistent with Scripture. It is not consistent with the biblical history and what's noted here. All right? The Most High does not have two peoples. He does not have two peoples that he's in covenant with. He only has one. Okay? And this Baptist ideology of dispensationalism, well, it didn't start, dispensationalism didn't start with the Baptists. Let me clear that up. Started with Darby in the 1800s. But the idea has to do with making these distinctions so as to say that Elohim has a plan going on with the church and Elohim has a different plan going on for Israel. But that's not consistent with Scripture. Okay? The Most High has always had an Israelite community that was an ethnically mixed people. And that is his purpose. Well, let's see what Isaiah has to say. All right. Isaiah's writing. Isaiah was, he was prophesying somewhere around about the 8th century BCE. Roughly 800 years or so before Messiah came, somewhere within that range. And listen to what it says. I'm reading verse 3 through verse 8. It says, "Do not let the foreigner joined to Yahuwah say, Yahuwah will surely separate me from his people. Do not let the eunuch say, I am just a dry tree. For thus says Yahuwah to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me, and hold fast to my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. And the foreigners or strangers or aliens, same term, who join themselves to Yahuwah to minister to him, to love the name of Yahuwah and to be his servants. All who keep the Sabbath and do not profane it and hold fast my covenant, those I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my house shall be called the house of prayer for all peoples. Verse 8. Thus says Adonai Yahuwah, who gathers the outcasts of Israel, I will gather others to them besides those already gathered. Now this is very, very powerful. Because here, what the Most High is doing, he is confirming the already understood truth that those who are strangers, aliens, foreigners, that if they join themselves to Yahuwah, that means they they convert to the faith of Israel and embrace Elohim, the Most High says that they will have a name that is great. He said that I'll give them a name greater than sons and daughters. That's pretty amazing that the Most High will elevate their position in such a way to give them a great name, greater than sons and daughters. Now I didn't write that. This is Elohim talking here. And it talks about the foreigners that join themselves to Yahuwah, that they will have the same status as those who are blood descendants. And then in verse 8 is what really hits home with me, because it says that Yahuwah, as he is gathering the outcasts of Israel, now this is prophetic here in verse 8, because the northern kingdom had not yet been scattered. But this is prophetic, where he's saying that Yahuwah, who gathers the outcasts of Israel, he's speaking prophetically about a future gathering. He said, I'm going to gather the outcasts of Israel, but when I gather those outcasts of Israel, I'm also gathering others besides those blood descendants too. In other words, there are going to be Gentiles who will be grafted into you that I am going to gather along with you. So what the Almighty is saying is that the stranger, the foreigner, the alien who chooses to embrace Elohim, the Elohim of Israel, keep his Sabbaths. In other words, there is no distinction between the blood descendant and the Gentile when it comes to what commandments are supposed to be kept. See, Torah specifically says there shall be one Torah both for the native born and also for the stranger. See? Now, let's keep going. We find that the requirements of the non-Hebrew converts for citizenship in the congregation of Israel are thus: circumcision and accepting the covenant. Those things are required. Exodus chapter 12, verses 48 through 49, it tells us that. Isaiah chapter 56, verses 6 through 7, it tells us that. These are things that are required for people coming in, all right? Keeping the Shabbat, keeping the commandments, circumcision, all of these things are a part. In other words, no one is prohibited from becoming a part of the house of Israel. All right? So when we talk about the congregation of the house of Israel, we're not talking about an ethnically Hebrew Israelite people. We're talking about an ethnically mixed Hebrew Israelite people. In other words, people from other ethnicities have chosen to embrace Elohim and his ways and become Israelites. And as I said a little earlier, the term Israel is a term that denotes the destiny and purpose of the covenant people. It represents he who rules with the mighty one. Specifically, it is indicative of Messiah himself and everyone attached to the Messiah. But we'll get into that a little bit later in our next lesson. Now, purposes, or the purpose of the covenant people. I want to go through this real quick and then we'll wrap this up. Purpose of the covenant people is to be a kingdom of priests, according to Exodus chapter 19, verse 6. To be a holy or a set-apart nation. That's also according to Exodus chapter 19, verse 6. And lastly, to be a light to the nations, according to Isaiah chapter 49, verses 3 through 6. So the purpose of the people of the Most High is to be a light to the nations. That's what Israel is to be. Inheritance under the first covenant. The land of Israel, or the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession. That's for us, according to Genesis chapter 48, verse 4. Also, to possess the nations, In Psalm chapter 2, verse 8, through Messiah, the scripture says that he is to possess the nations, and since he is to possess the nations, his people are supposed to possess the nations. And lastly, to be the head of the nations. If you look at Exodus chapter 19, verse 5, and Devarim, or Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6, that Israel, covenant people, is to be the head of the nations. So we find here that there's an inheritance that the covenant people of the Most High have. There's a purpose that the covenant of the people of Elohim have. And that purpose has not changed. All of this has been noted with reference to the first covenant. I like to call the first covenant the first congregational covenant. That's what this is here. This congregational covenant outlined the way in which the covenant people are supposed to live, its purpose, its inheritance. And when we talk about the renewed covenant in part 2, which we will cover on in our next lesson, we will show also how that the purposes and the inheritance has not changed. It's just been solidified in the Messiah. And so with that, we're going to close. Blessed be He. Abba Yah, we thank you for your mercies, your graciousness, and your kindness, and we trust today that the teaching has been edifying to those who have taken the time to open their heart and their mind to receive truth. We trust that your disciples, your Talmudim, have been encouraged, that your Talmudim have gleaned, and that they will take these nuggets and not only bury them in their heart and in their mind, but also communicate this information with those with whom they teach. That they'll have a proper understanding of the covenant people of the Most High, knowing that you are an Elohim that has made the way available for all mankind to become a part and be admitted to your house. And for that we thank you. In Yeshua's great name be glorified. Amen. Well, I trust that all of you have been encouraged by the teaching. And for those of you who are watching us by live stream, we thank you for tuning in. Trust that this has been helpful to your understanding of the people of the Most High, that Elohim has only one people with which he is gathering all ethnicities to become a part of and to be joined into, to become one redeemed people of the Most High on the earth. That's Yisrael. And presently, we regard that people as Messianic Israel. We make that distinction because we know that only through the Messiah can a man be restored to fellowship with the Almighty. And so we trust that you have been blessed by this teaching, and we ask that you will continue to attend these classes, and that you would also develop a greater affinity with us. We are open to receive all of you that desire to connect with us. And for those who may be interested in School of Messiah Bible Institute, please go to our website at www.ncmmi.20m.com, and you go to the NCMMI links. You can click on School of Messiah Bible Institute and read up on what is offered, the curriculum that we've made available, and make SOMBI your tool for developing and getting prepared to do the work and service of the King. We thank each of you so much. If this teaching has been a blessing to you, please share a donation at that same website. You can click on the donate button, or you can do it by Cash App, which is $NCMMI. Well, the Most High bless each and every one of you. We thank you for participating. Shalom.